Hello, and welcome to BigWorldNetwork.com author interview. I'm Jim McGovern, joined by co-host Mario Hernandez, CTO for Big World Network. Hello, Mario.
Hey, guys.
And we're honored to have as our guest today author Jonathan Thompson. He's written A House Divided and Average, which are two very different but exciting books. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
No problem.
Let's start out with some basics. Where did you grow up, Jonathan, originally?
I grew up in New York, about an hour north of the city, little suburb. It's actually the setting for Average.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
That's right. Where do you live now?
I live in Louisiana, the middle of Cajun country. My neighbors are rice farmers and cows.
That's quite a change from the city, I'm sure.
Yeah. I've actually really been enjoying it. It's been a year now that I've been down here. Almost. I moved last November.
You haven't picked up any kind of Cajun accent yet. I'm disappointed.
Sometimes my wife says it slips out. Every once in a while. I know recently she thought it was hilarious. I don't even remember what we were talking about, but I said, y'all gotta relax. And she said, hilarious.
Yeah. So, as a kid, did you write much, or was this something that you took on as an adult?
No, I always wrote. It was always my stock answer. Like, for what I was going to do when I grew up, I was going to write. So I just kind of kept doing it till it worked.
Yeah. Now, you're a professional writer, but most of your writing professionally has been nonfiction. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a certified personal trainer and nutritionist, so I do a lot of health and fitness writing.
Yeah. So Average and A House Divided are your first published fiction books. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about A House Divided, and I'll share the cover here so people can see it.
And people can feel free to ask questions. We do have an email set up now, questions@bigworldnetwork.com, and also if you're a Google Plus person, you can ask questions right on here. So feel free to do that whenever you like.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about A House Divided, Jonathan.
A House Divided, I had written it several years ago. I think it really started about 10 years ago as a short story that I wrote mostly during history class in high school, my senior year. I used to carry around notebooks and not actually pay attention during class and write books. And
I think that seems to be kind of a common denominator for writers.
So I had written a short story that I liked and just kind of hung on to for a while. And then one of my first writing jobs out of high school, I think I was like 19, I got a job mainly ghostwriting for a small startup production company. I pretty much only got the job out of nepotism because I knew the founder's mom, and she got me the job. So I was working for him, and in the process of it, working on like different graphic novels and stuff, and he was always asking me if I had anything I wanted to work on, any of my stories, and he'd let me work under my name. And I had this story I'd been sitting on, and I thought it would be really cool to turn it into a graphic novel. So I worked up A House Divided, and I had an artist lined up. Actually, we went through several illustrators, and one after another, they all kind of faded, and then eventually the company folded. And I still had this story, and I still really believed in it. And then like 5 years went by where nothing happened. I had it. I had this story. It was done, but I didn't have the money to self-publish, and I wasn't really interested in self-publishing.
Was it done as a graphic novel at that time, or in its present form?
Pretty much. It was written as a graphic novel. I mean, I didn't have any real artwork. I had some concept art, but I can't personally do sequential art, so I just didn't bother. Yeah. And some of the other artists I had worked with had come up with some quick little, like, certain pages or concepts that I still may have somewhere. But, so, yeah, I just didn't do anything with it. And then I kind of stumbled on a posting for Big World Network somewhere, and figured, well, I wrote it as a comic book, as a graphic novel, so it's an easy transition now to, just fill out the narrative a little bit and turn it into a serialized novel.
Sure. Would it be fair to describe it as a dystopian novel? Maybe that's the wrong word, but
yeah, that's usually what I say. I don't know. I'm bad at that stuff.
yeah.
I don't.
Let the reader decide, right?
I don't really even think of myself as a science fiction writer. That's usually where I'm grouped, and I understand that, like, strictly speaking, A House Divided is, but that's not really how I see myself. I don't know. I just kind of write stuff and hope for the best.
So what's the basics of the novel, of the book?
Yeah, I guess it starts out as a pretty traditional dystopian novel. Is that what you're asking about, like a synopsis?
Yeah. But what's the basic of the story?
The idea is that there's this civilization in kind of a post-apocalyptic Earth that has rebuilt with minimal technology, basically trying to avoid the mistakes of the past. And one of the ways they do it is by limiting any kind of mental illness, and their definition of the term is very broad.
Yeah.
And, basically, it's all about eugenics. They're cleaning the gene pool. They're trying to purify humanity, and but they won't just wipe these people out, because that would be genocide and that would be terrible. So instead, they stick them in a ghetto and use them as a workforce, and it's basically about the struggle between those two different societies that are still part of the same society but are very opposed to each other.
I like the way you've told the story through various first-person viewpoints or perspectives. Is there a character that you particularly like or relate to in it? That's a tough question, I know.
I think Malcolm, probably. When I wrote Malcolm and Isaiah, who are really the two main characters, they both kind of represent different parts of my own voice. They were the easiest for me to write, and I think the vast majority of the book is from their point of view. Yeah, I enjoyed them the most. And even when you read it in the book, there's definite similarities between their characters. And that's kind of what makes their conflict, for me, more interesting.
Sure.
Did you find this subject intriguing as a way of just they always say you write what you know and everything, and did you find you had the story, you had some sympathy for this kind of things, or maybe third world countries or whatever, what's going on in the world, or do you know where that came from?
Yeah, it's actually kind of more allegorical than that. I deal with a chronic depressive disorder, and the book was kind of my own struggle with dealing with a mental illness, basically.
Sure.
I wrote it while I was coming to terms with this. So, I mean, again, I was writing it to be a graphic novel, so it's a little bit more outrageous than but that's really what it is. It's meant to be kind of a look at what is sanity and what it means, and how sometimes that spark of madness is really cool and really useful, but it can also be really misplaced.
Yeah, for sure, and I mean, and that's awesome too, because people a lot of times use writing as an outlet for feelings, and I'm guessing it helped you through that, which is awesome. Almost like a therapy for people.
Right, and that's why I say that it's weird for me to be classified or to think of myself as a science fiction writer, because that's not how I meant it.
Yeah.
I wasn't writing it for the sake of it being science fiction. I just had a really weird idea, and there was no other way to tell it than with science fiction.
Well, I'll tell you, you're definitely a versatile writer. I mean, aside from your background, or at least professionally writing nonfiction, your other book, Average, is a very different book from A House Divided. Tell us a little bit about where the idea came from Average. Well, give us a basis of the story first, actually.
Average is a superhero novel, which I didn't even realize was a genre until after I started writing it. I was actually a little mad because I kind of thought that I had stumbled on something new, and I have not. Average was a dream I had.
Okay.
Yeah, I had this dream one night where I was the son of a superhero, and I had no powers, but he was like Superman-style superhero, like basically could do whatever he wanted. And he was convinced that I had to have powers, and that the only way to discover them would be to make me fight crime and make me do something, and just hope my power appeared. And his way of doing that was to start a house fire and have me deal with it. But he was actually the powers behind it. And at one point in the dream, he picked up the house and had me pretending to pick it up. I'm not sure how that was supposed to help with the fire.
Yeah.
But that's what happened in my dream. And then my dad got excited and thought that maybe I could really do it, so he let go of the house. And it fell on me, and then I woke up. And I woke up, and I looked at Heather. I'm like, I think I had an idea for a story. And I told her the dream, and she said, yeah, write it. So at that point, I was still writing A House Divided, and I have a tendency to not finish stories. So I kind of put Average on the back burner. I think I immediately emailed you, Jim, that day and said, I have this idea. I can't do it yet, but I'm gonna.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, so that's Average.
That's fantastic. Well, it's a great book. It's a lot of fun.
I had fun writing
I really enjoyed it.
I've heard a lot of comments about the vast difference between A House Divided and Average, and I wrote them at very different times. And for me, honestly, Average, I prefer Average, and I kind of feel like when I go back and look at A House Divided, I feel like it represents me a very immature state in my writing career. I feel like my voice has changed. I've changed I would change the book. If I could go back and change stuff about it, I absolutely would. I like the story, but I've grown in the way that I write since then.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, managing editor Mana Avison isn't here, so you confess up. Writing serialized fiction, where there's deadlines for each episode, is that difficult for you, or did you have it written in advance? How far ahead are you when you were writing it?
Be careful, she's watching.
And did it help you with?
I still don't feel safe. No, it's very valuable for me to have those deadlines because I would get nothing done. I try to stay ahead. I do. But I'm bad at it. I'm very, very bad at it. I go through spurts. I think there was one point when writing A House Divided where I was just barely keeping up with the deadlines from week to week. I was driving Amanda crazy. And then I got sick with the flu for like 2 weeks. And I think in a day I wrote the entire 3rd season.
Wow.
Because I was home and bored and just cranked it out. I generally go into a story knowing where it's going to go. I know everybody has their own approaches. I basically start my stories with the ending.
That's a good place.
And
I really...
Yeah, I like it. I've heard a lot of other opinions, but it works for me. Because otherwise I wander. And that's something I've really had to struggle with in writing serialized. Because from week to week it has to hold people's attention. And if I kind of meander too much and ramble, it slows the story down.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you work better under
I
pressure? Sometimes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. I really won't get anything done unless I have a definite deadline.
That's right. Hey, we have a comment from May Woodworth, and she says your down-to-earth, open communication is refreshing. She especially loved that you speak openly about depression, a topic that resonates with so many people. So, which is very true, you know.
Yeah, it's very common, and people a lot of times people are just kind of hesitant to talk about it, but it's something I've had to deal with, and it affects what I do. So, and that's where average comes from.
Yeah.
I mean, how's not average.
And people, I think, fail to realize that we are like the sum of our parts and not just, one thing, and that sometimes those things make us who we are eventually, especially getting through it, and finding our strength that way, which it's not something to be
for sure
shamed upon.
Right.
Yeah. We do have a question, too, if you want to answer one of the audience's question. They were looking for advice for starting to write their own dystopian novel. For those who are unsure, do you have any advice to how to start one?
How to start one? I'd say come up with, well, what makes it different? Because that's the issue with dystopian novels, is they've been done a lot.
Just recently, most definitely.
Yeah, and there's honestly so many different ways the world can go wrong. So, so just try to be creative about that one conflict. If you have that one conflict, what makes that dystopia so wrong? Because sometimes it can be something strange that we don't think about. That if the world didn't have this one thing or had too much of this one thing, it can change everything.
Sure.
So I'd say if you start with that one conflict and just make it different and just dwell on that, really, really think about how that would change it.
This is probably an unfair question to ask you, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. Did you find, but comparing Average and A House Divided, did you find one a little bit more of a challenge than the other to write? Was it more difficult, or, again, they're so different, it's...
I actually found Average more challenging, as much as it's closer to my voice, the way that I actually talk and the way that I actually think. It was harder for me because, and I do think there are places in the story where the shows, where I would just kind of start talking rather than telling a story. And I have a tendency to do that in my writing. I tend to be more character-oriented than plot-oriented, and that can be an issue because books need stories.
Yeah.
So Average, it was much more tempting for me to just kind of start ranting about things I wanted to talk about, whereas A House Divided was very story-driven, and there wasn't room for that.
Yeah. So let me ask you a little bit about your writing habits. We talked a little bit about it already, but is there a certain time of day that you find more productive to write, or does it come in spurts?
It definitely comes in spurts. I have to be ready to just write notes down, and because sometimes I'll be laying in bed or just sitting around, and I think of something, and even if it's just one or two lines of dialogue and doesn't really fit into a story, I'll think, oh, that's really good. Oh, I'll write it down later. I'll remember it. I'll write it down later, and then I lose it 10 minutes later. And
yeah. Do you keep a notebook with you now, or?
I use my tablet for most things because I always have it.
Yeah.
And I tend to mind map my stories rather than like a regular outline. So sometimes I'll just throw those things onto a mind map.
Sure. Do you feel like you really live those stories? Because I know I've heard some authors that that whole story plays out in their head, and they are it for some intents and purposes.
Yeah, to a certain extent. I also talk to myself a lot when I'm writing. I will I will have the dialogues with myself while I'm writing them, which is a little strange.
I don't know. You gotta like hear it. You know, you gotta actually say
Yeah,
it.
exactly. It helps me to make it natural, because I really enjoy writing dialogue,
Yeah.
and I like to play with that. So I will play the characters.
That makes total sense, though. I mean, so many authors, the dialogue just doesn't quite work. There's something that's not real about it, you know, that it just doesn't fit. So.
And I think it's just because the language is unnatural sometimes. They have in their head a certain way that the characters should talk, especially with sci-fi, because you're setting things in a different world, with the different, and you're building cultures very often. So yeah, they're going to talk different, but at the same time, it can't be off-putting.
Yeah.
I recently read a book like that. I'm not going to say what it was because it's a very well-known book. But the characters used kind of a little slang, and it was constant, and it was to the point where it was distracting from the story. It didn't feel natural.
Yeah.
I think that's a risk that you run when you're dealing with sci-fi, especially.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It wasn't Ender's Game, was it? The only reason why I asked that, there's a lot of slang in that, but
no, it wasn't Ender's Game.
That's a good thing. That's one of my favorite sci-fi.
Oh yeah, it's a great, but no, it wasn't Ender's Game.
Yeah, just curious. What do you find the most difficult part of the process of writing? Is it the editing? Is it obviously the ideas come to you fairly easily. I mean, with Average, it was in a dream. But what do you find to be the most difficult process of the writing?
Actually having a story, really. Because Average, I have a concept, and that concepts, I get those. I'll have a basic idea and a very, very basic concept of who the main character is, what their conflict is, all that. But as far as where the story's going to go, I'm not too great with that. So
yeah,
that's often a challenge for me.
Sure.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. All right, so some general questions for you. What do you prefer to read with? Ebook, paperback, hardcover, or audiobook? I guess that's not really reading, but we'll throw that in there.
Reading with your ear.
Yeah.
I went through a phase where I was all audiobooks because I was a delivery driver for edible arrangements, and I was on the road a lot. And I think I read Atlas Shrugged in about 3 days, just because I was driving and I just put it on and I could just listen to it, and I loved that. I don't use it as much anymore. Heather and I still do some very, very long road trips, so sometimes I'll bring an audiobook for that. But otherwise, it's all ebooks.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because many authors, swear by paperback. Oh, I can't read ebooks, but I'm with you. I actually do most of my reading on the iPad.
Yeah. Every once in a while, there's a local thrift store that sells 8 books for $1.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah, and I can't turn that away. So, so every once in a while, I'll go and I'll load up on them, but I'll bring them back and donate them back when I'm done because I just don't have room for books. That's really what it comes down to.
Sure.
We've moved several times in the last year, and I just can't be carting around all these books.
Yeah. So, what is your favorite book, or do you have a favorite? That again, it's a tough question.
Is it Ender's Game?
It's not. I think if I really had to pin it down to my favorite book, I don't reread books typically.
Really?
Very, very rarely do I reread a book. But one book that I have reread, I think 4 times, is Kurt Vonnegut, Man Without a Country. It's just kind of his last ramblings. I think it's the last thing he wrote before he died. And I love it because it's so him. It's like just hanging out with Kurt Vonnegut, and he was.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
It's a very easy read, but part of what I loved about reading Vonnegut was that his personality came out so much in his stories, and that he was so eclectic. He never saw himself as a sci-fi writer because he just kind of wrote what he felt like writing, and it ended up being weird, and people didn't know what else to call it, so they called it sci-fi. And
yeah.
And I enjoy that about Man Without a Country. Is it's just very much him, and it's very genuine and very honest. Even though there's no real stories, it's just kind of him talking about himself and his life. I really love that book.
Again, I probably shouldn't ask this one, but the discussion came up recently about books that you had to read as part of your education or in school. The classics. Did you have a book that was your least favorite? I remember in college we had to do James Joyce, and it was like Finnegan's Wake. It was the most painful class I've ever sat through.
Funny story about required reading in school. I didn't do it.
Cliff Notes?
On sale.
I would read, like, they would assign books, and I would read the first few pages, and I would read the back, and then I would just make it up.
BS along the way.
Yeah, and actually what ended up happening, and I kind of wrote this into Average, actually. The main character, Quinn, talks about doing that, and then he talks about how one of his favorite teacher figured out what he was doing and started making all of the tests very, very specific and asking questions like, what color hat was so-and-so wearing on such and such a page? My teacher did that to me.
Oh, no.
That is a true story.
So did you start reading them after that, or just got more creative in your...
I was just... I always had my own reading list, basically. And a lot of times I read the books that we would read in school. I just read them at other times.
Yeah. Well, yeah, reading should be something that's pleasure. You read for pleasure, and when you're told what to read, and, it becomes work, and it's no longer fun and enjoyable.
Right. So I was really bad about it. I struggled through, what was that book? Old Man in the Sea.
Yeah.
Man, that was a rough one. I will never read that book again.
Yeah.
I got a question, actually. If you mind, Jim. Anyway, so obviously you've got 2 books under your belt now here from us, and I'm hopefully there's some more along the way. Is there anything that you would want to write or have an idea, or like a certain genre, since you've got sci-fi and superheroes there? Maybe some romance or or something in the works?
No, I do have another one I'm working on. This one I'm trying to have it complete before I give it to Amanda to make it look like I'm a good writer. I would just, after going through the process of writing 2 serials, I think it would be easier for me if I was just done with it and then hand it in and then release it as a serial. I don't know what to call this one as far as genre. I guess it's just kind of a straight story. I don't think there's any weird elements. I mean, there might be. We'll see what happens when I actually start writing it.
Sure. I love those undefinables. Like, usually when you don't, they are comedy, they're drama, they're a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it really doesn't matter what they are because, like you said, it's just a story. You're just trying to tell a story, and that's awesome.
Right. And I've noticed that sometimes when I think that it is one thing, the readers decide that it's something else. I had a very strange experience a few years ago. I wrote a play and had it staged in kind of it was like a 1-act play contest, and I thought it was a comedy. I thought it was hilarious. They entered it as a drama. and it was kind of an odd experience for me because it just made me realize that if I try too hard to make it one thing, it can be cheesy. And I had talked to another writer about it, and he's like, because I told him I was honestly kind of a little worried because I'm like, I thought it was really funny, and I guess they didn't. And he said that it's good because when you're writing comedy, you run the risk of it being corny.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I just kind of write and don't give too much thought about categories.
Yeah.
So
That's a good way.
So this new one, yeah, it definitely does have some strange elements to it, but for me, those just become storytelling tools. If I want to tell something, or explain something that doesn't necessarily exist in the world, I'll kind of revert to doing it in kind of a science fiction way usually.
Yeah. How has the editing process been for you, working with Amanda and her team? And actually, I can't even remember who the associate editors were for Average or for A House Divided. But how was the process? I mean,
fantastic. I've enjoyed working with it. I've actually, yeah, it's been good for me to have a second, or in some cases, third pair of eyes on it. Just because, you know, when you work on a story for so long, you kind of get sick of actually reading it. I haven't read A House Divided since it was finished. What was that, 2, maybe 3 years ago?
Yeah.
I haven't read it since because I dealt with the story for so long. I'm like, I'm done. I'm done. So it's good for me to, and the story has to be read so many times before it's actually released. Between me writing it and then the editors doing their thing and then the narrator, it gets read so many times. So somebody's gonna catch something. So it's very helpful for me to have that. And sometimes I think sentences make sense and they don't outside of my brain.
I get that a lot too.
And Amanda seems to have a knack for sort of translating my odd wording. So it works. It's good.
Yeah, that's great. So, you know, just a couple more general questions. Who inspires you the most in your life? And I don't mean necessarily author and you know, what on a day-to-day basis, who do you feel the most inspired by, would you say?
My wife.
Yeah,
Heather.
that's fantastic.
People are always, because I'm a freelance writer, so I work from home, I make my own schedule, you know, and people are always kind of envious of that, and they're like, oh, it must be so great to work for yourself, and I always say, I don't work for myself, I work for Heather. Because I would get nothing done. I honestly wouldn't. I am terrible at managing my time and staying focused. I would just binge watch Netflix all day and not get anything done. So she kind of keeps me focused, and she helps me with my stories very often because I just need a sounding board. When I have an idea, I just need to say it out loud and have somebody else listen to it, and not necessarily even give any feedback. I just need, a sounding board. And she's been dealing with me making up stories for a couple years now, so she does pretty good.
She's used to it.
Yeah, actually, she did the narration for Average.
That's right. I was about to mention that. Yeah, she's the narrator for Average for the audiobook.
And she did a great job. It was fun working with her on it because people who know us both have said that it's like hearing my words come out of Heather's mouth, and because she changes them. She's a very expressive person, and when you listen to Average, she really brings a lot of energy to it, and it's kind of a little bit more dramatic than your average audiobook reading.
Is that difficult? You know, you've had two different narrators, you know, a different narrator for House Divided and then a narrator for Average. Hearing somebody else read it, you know, the tone and everything else, does it bother you that sometimes it's different than how you imagined it, or does it actually bring something out of it that you hadn't thought of, that how they interpret it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I did the narration for A House Divided.
Yep, that's right. You did. I apologize. Yep, that's right.
But
So therefore, the tone is pretty straightforward.
You would think so, but no. There were several cases in A House Divided where when I was reading it, I realized this sounds weird, or I heard something else in the wording that I kind of changed the narration in where I put the emphasis.
Yeah, and there's definitely a difference when you read something out loud versus, you know, in your head. I mean,
yeah, exactly. And Heather did very well with Average. She knows the way I talk, and Average pretty much is written the way I talk. So she kind of just brought that to it. And in several cases, she would record options where when she did the narration, you know, it might be a 7-minute long episode, but what she gave me was a half hour worth of audio.
Yeah. Did you give her a lot of pointers, or did you kind of just let her read it and interpret it, the voices herself?
The first couple episodes, I sat in while she was reading it, and she would read through it once, and then I'd kind of direct her, and then she would record. But you know, after so many episodes, she knew who the characters were, she knew how to read it, and she would just do it. And if I needed something, if when I was editing it, I heard something I wanted changed, we would just re-record that section.
Yeah.
I'm sure after a while she got the voice kind of had a feeling, and you didn't need to direct so much.
Right. Yeah. It got to the point where I would just set up the mic, and I'd leave and take the dogs out, because we have a husky, so she's always yelling about something. The husky, not Heather.
I knew what you meant.
Clarification.
So you know, I get the dogs out of the way, get them quiet, and she would record, and then I just come back and edit.
Sure.
Yeah. Which, by the way, the audiobook versions of both of those are available on the BigWorldNetwork.com store, and the paperback versions of both A House Divided and Average, as well as the ebook, are available actually the paperback's available on our store or Amazon, and the ebook is exclusively available on Amazon for both of those books.
Right. And if you have Prime, you can borrow the book for free, so for those who are out there.
That's right. And the author still gets paid with Prime.
Yes.
Not as much. So buy the book. It's worth having both. Mario, do you have any other questions for Jonathan?
Not really. I mean, there's still time if anybody has any questions to ask through Google Plus or email at questions@bigworldnetwork.com. It's just I just love listening to authors and talk about how they do it, because it's such a personal thing, writing, and I always believe, like, you guys are so vulnerable when you write, because you're putting yourself out there, and it's such I don't know how you guys do it some days, and I give so much respect for you guys.
Yeah.
I think it's cool.
Hey, you know, you were talking about genres earlier. Do you have a least favorite genre that you don't like to read? I mean, or is your reading spread out through?
I tend to be pretty eclectic in my reading. Yeah, I don't really pick anything. If something catches my eye, I'll read it. It is strange to me. I was thinking about this the other day, that when I was a teenager, I did not read teen lit or young adult literature. I was so over that. But now I actually find myself reading it a lot. I think I really enjoy just being able to read, you know, burn through a book in a couple days, and it be a fast-moving story and be interesting, and it's And I just think it's funny, you know, I'm 29 years old, and now I'm going back and reading that.
It's funny you mentioned that. I literally just yesterday read an article about, you know, the young adult genre, but the people that are reading it are adults, you
Right.
know, not young adults, and actually more. It certainly increased the reading with, you know, some of these movies that have
Right.
come from young adult series and things like that. But it's adults that's reading it, and the numbers were, I think it was actually higher in some cases than the actual young adults that are, you know, whatever they classify it as, 12 to whatever. But yeah,
That
it's
might
interesting. Many
that might
adults are reading them.
right. That might be because, you know, when you're a kid, you don't want to do kid things. You're always trying to be more adult, and then when you're
Right.
adult, you're trying to go back, and I guess that's a way to do it.
Yeah. And a lot of writers are going to it now.
Oh yeah,
James Patterson is writing YA now. You know, it's kind of just where literature in general is going. It seems like.
Yeah.
yeah. Certainly Harry Potter and Allegiant and, you know, that series of books have definitely driven that genre and um, increased the popularity tremendously. But yeah, a lot of authors that would never have anything to do with young adult, it was almost a stigma, are now kind of moving in that direction.
It might be freeing, I guess, for some authors too, because, you know, I guess reading was, I don't want to say serious, but it was always like you had to have a topic that was more grounded, I guess. And young adult, you can do anything. You can do whatever you want. You know, you want vampires, you want werewolves, you want aliens. Just there you go.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
So.
And there's a cat.
Yeah, the cat is back. Let me. Sorry, she has to appear in every interview there. But,
Right.
Well, Jonathan, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so.
I definitely enjoyed this. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you so much for giving up your time. I know you had a very busy weekend, and you're in New Orleans right now. That's correct?
I am. I just did a con, a small sci-fi convention over the past days. I didn't go today. But yeah, I did some panels on Friday and Saturday, and it was a small, just local convention, but it was a lot of fun. Sold a couple books. A lot of people were asking about Big World, so that was cool. Yeah, exciting. It was my first time doing anything like this.
Yeah. Well, you've been. We were talking just before we went on air. Jonathan was with us from the very first season, in the beginning, before we ever launched the website, and, you know, still kind of formulating the whole serialized network thing. So you've been a big part of it from the beginning.
Right.
And for that, I'm very grateful to have your talent.
You know, one of the things we were talking about at the convention this weekend was I did a panel on indie publishers in general, and it was kind of funny. Somebody asked me how I got into working with indie publishers, and I said nobody else would have me.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like, and it's true. I had tried with some other publishing houses, and it was just...
It's demoralizing sometimes, I think, and they miss out on a lot of great talent.
Right. We talked to a lady this weekend. We were at a con too, a small con here in Minnesota, and she was telling me that she had a story about 18-year-old character, which considered young adult. 18-year-old is still young adult, but since two of the main characters were like in their 50s and their 30s and everything, that it wasn't young adult anymore, and they turned her away because they didn't want it to be. They wanted to change the characters, and it's just like that story may be fantastic, but since they have this, like, I don't want to say stigma, but they have this mindset that you had to have exactly like this because these make the money and nothing else. You know, they don't want to take anything, which is silly.
And it's hard to get published too if you don't, now with the big publishing houses, unless you have a huge following already, you know, and you're left to do a lot of your own marketing anyhow, even with a big house.
You know, I didn't know that until recently. I was kind of doing some research for that panel because I was a little scared about doing a panel called the indie publishing industry, and I'm not actually in the industry. I'm just a writer, you know. So, so I was doing all sorts of research on it, and I honestly didn't realize that. You know, a lot of people just assume that you have your agent and you have the publisher, and they're going to sell your book. All you have to do is write it.
Not even close.
Not true.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
there's writers who, invest thousands of dollars even after they've spent money on an agent and worked to get a publisher, and they're selling their own books.
Right.
Yep. It's
Yeah.
very true.
Because even if you give money to a publisher like some of these vanity publishers,
Right.
and it'll be like, well, give us this much, we'll match it, and we'll do some marketing and everything, and usually that's gone within like a few months, and then it's just like, well, have
Yeah.
fun. We did our part.
Yeah.
So,
That's
and I guess that's one thing about us too, that we can't, do all the advertising or whatever, but we always give the resources. I mean, there's so many free resources out there and ways to do this that we want to help you guys do, because if you do good, we do good, and like, why wouldn't we want you to do well?
Right.
Yeah. Well, once again, before we go, and I'll put the covers up here, the two books is A House Divided, which again is available on Amazon.com. You can get the ebook, and I'm not sure currently what the price is on that. I probably should have looked before. Mario, you might know offhand. Unfortunately, Amazon will alter prices, periodically and
Right.
adjust them.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. If you have, it's only because if you have like Prime, they will actually give you a discount for paperback. So that's always a good thing to think about. Is you do get a little bit of a discount for paperbacks at least,
I don't know.
But the two books
But you-
are A House Divided and, we'll bring up the picture, Average. And again, two very different books, but both fantastically written books, well narrated, and very enjoyable.
very much
And Jonathan, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And I can't wait for your third book with us.
Yeah,
So keep
we'll see
writing.
what it turns into.
We may have to have you sign the contract if it takes too long, just so you have that deadline to.
so.
That's not a bad idea.
Now that you fessed up, that you need that deadline to go. So.
And if anybody's wondering, for Amazon, House Divided is currently $3.99 for ebook, $8 or $7.99 for paperback, and Average is $8.99 for paperback and $3.99 for ebook. So check them out.
And again, on BigWorldNetwork.com store, you can get the audio book if you would prefer that. So.
Yeah, audiobook is $7.99 for House Divided, and $6.99 for House Divided, $7.99 for Average. So check it out.
All right. Well, again, Jonathan, thank you, and enjoy your stay while you're there in New Orleans.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure,
All right.
man.
Take
Yeah.
care.
Thank you.